Okay, welcome everybody to the Emerging Global Consensus in 21st Century Financial Architecture. I had to read that one. My name is Joanna Marathakis. I lead our Financial Crimes Compliance Department at Circle. I'm joined here by Heath Tarbert, who is our Chief Legal Officer and Head of Global Policy, Head of Corporate Affairs. Dante Disparte sends his apologies. Unfortunately, was not able to make it because of the weather. But it's good because it means we get more time to talk to Heath.
You may regret that, but it is what it is. And don't worry, the cocktail hours after this. So we'll have some fun. And I think because we have a small crowd, we can, we'll go through, we'll have a dialogue. But then if people want to join in and ask questions or whatever, we can certainly do that. Because as Jeremy said earlier in the day, like everybody that's part of this ecosystem, all the relevant constituencies are literally in the room. So we want this to be a helpful discussion, and quite frankly, many of you may have some things to add.
Awesome. So Heath, let me start out with you. So you joined Circle just this summer after serving as the CFTC chairman, as well as Treasury, World Bank, and US Senate, among many others. So kind of thinking about the US and beyond, how would you categorize the legal and regulatory maturity of the digital asset space here as compared to others that you've seen overseas? And did that change, if all, since joining Circle?
Yeah, so I would compare it to where we are in other markets, right? So I've worked in the securities markets, I've worked in the derivatives markets, and so I've seen kind of the trajectory of some of the deepest, most important markets in the world. And it's clear we're not there yet in the digital asset space, but I would say we're getting there. We're sort of like in the adolescent phase. In the sense that it's been about 10 years. It's starting to get to the point where there is wider and wider spread usage. And we're also getting to the point, as was part of the conversation earlier, that now people are saying, wow, this is actually something. This is not a fad. This is the real deal. This is going to go somewhere. And we need to have kind of a sound regulatory framework here in the United States and abroad as well. And so that's kind of where we are. I would say we're probably a year or two behind in the United States than in Europe and some of the other jurisdictions that we'll talk about, but we're getting there.
Yeah, I tend to agree. So what would you say are one or two regulators that you think actually do appreciate some of the opportunities and risks of the space and are actually moving forward and are ahead of the curve?
Well, I wish I could say the United States, right? I wish I could say. To be fair, as a former CFTC chair, and we had another one, my friend and predecessor, Chris Giancarlo, I think the CFTC, for its part, has made some strides and recognized that these are important markets. But ultimately, it has to be something that the SEC, the CFTC, and all the US regulators, including the banking regulators, are on the same page. So I think we're getting there, but it's still going to be a longer road, quite frankly, than in other countries. So who are countries that I would say, they get it, so to speak? I'll give you two very, very different countries. The first would be Singapore. And I love Singapore. How many people have been to Singapore? Yeah, many people in this room. I mean, if you think about it, Singapore is a country that literally has no natural resources whatsoever. Yet they've become, over the last 50 years or so, really, quite frankly, over the last 30 years or so, into the world's great financial centers. And so they understand the power of blockchain technology, digital currency. They're being smart about it. They're being cautious. But I would use them as an example. And Ravi Menon, who was the former head of MAS, who was my colleague on the Financial Stability Board, I think was recently quoted by saying, Singapore is open to blockchain innovation, and we're closed to cryptocurrency speculation. So they clearly get it, that there's something here. It's not sort of let's throw the baby out with the bathwater, which quite frankly I hear from Washington from time to time. But clearly they're moving ahead. It's a country that we have an office in. I actually have a physical location there. We recently got licensed and we're operationalizing that. So I would say Singapore is an example where I think they see the promise here. They're moving forward. The other example, very different country, France. Right? And anybody here French? There we go. All right. So when I think of France, I love France. I think of art. I think of culture. They have a very mature banking sector. I've had a number of French clients over the year. But I don't think of France typically as like a major focusing on financial innovation and stuff like that until recently. With Brexit, the French see this, I think, as a tremendous opportunity to put Paris back on the map as one of the world's great financial centers. And I have been so impressed with the French government, with the research, the focus that they have had in the digital assets area, as well as their focus on bringing in business. And so that is another country that I think really understands the importance of this sector. And we have found them to be of the highest degree of with technical knowledge, as well as prudence and judgment. So I would hold France up as a great example as well. But again, very, very different country than Singapore historically in the space.
No, I think that's exactly right. And even just from my limited space, talking about the financial crime side of it, when I talk to the French or the Singaporean regulators, it's a very different conversation. They understand the risks, they understand what we're trying to do and how to put in place an appropriate program. We just don't get the same thing here in the States, particularly for Circle as a money transmitter license holder. It's difficult to try and educate 46 different regulators, but we get through, but hopefully that will also change over time.
And there are other examples as well, but you asked for two, so those are the two that were top of mind. And we have an office we're building in France as well, and we're applying for a license there.
That's right. So just like we've got some great regulators out there, we've got some that are a little less great. They welcome crypto with open arms and kind of with a wink and a nudge. They say that they're going to regulate them, but it's kind of an agreement. So it gives rise to a lot of opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. And it puts companies with high ethics like Circle at a disadvantage compared to some of the others. And it also discourages economic activity here in the US. So how and when might this change? Kind of recognizing that some of the supranational bodies like FATF or the FSB have a role to play in this. Will this kind of disequilibrium persist until the US has clear regs?
Do you want to name names? Which countries are you talking about in particular?
Let's talk, Seychelles, Lithuania, those sorts of ones, Estonia.
Fair enough. Anybody from those countries here? Everyone's like, not me. So here's what I think. Okay, right now, obviously, some of the major exchanges have moved offshore to these places. It doesn't concern me in the long run, because I think ultimately, look, if I'm and I've worked for some of the large financial institutions, if I'm going to trade $100,000 in digital assets, fine, I'll do it on an exchange in the Seychelles. If I'm going to trade $100 million, I'm not going to be doing that, right? I want it to be, and if you look at the world's great financial centers, we're in one right now, New York, London, soon to be Paris as on the rise, Singapore, and until sort of recently, or at least historically, Hong Kong, other places around the world, they've all been strong rule of law countries where that if your property is there are specific legal and other guarantees, right? And the other institutions that are playing in those spaces are legitimate institutions, counterparties that you can trust, right? So I think right now, once sort of digital assets hits the mainstream, and I really think we're on the cusp of that, per Jeremy's argument today, his initial remarks, I think these jurisdictions are going to fall back and not be as important as they are. So they don't concern me as much as others. I think what does concern me is the fact that in other jurisdictions like the United States, we have created a regulatory environment that is so hostile that people feel the need to move offshore.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense, what you're saying, for sure. We kind of heard earlier today in the conversation with House Financial Services Chair Patrick McHenry about his efforts on both sides of the aisle to advance that legislation. But as much as he's trying to make that great progress, there's just this kind of being held hostage by political hardball in Washington. Now we're kind of heading into a shutdown as well as a presidential election year that's probably not going to get any better anytime soon. So when you talk to foreign policymakers and business leaders, what do you hear about that political dynamic in the US? And are countries seeking to take advantage of our perceived absence of leadership in this space?
You know, it's interesting. I think at the end of the day, it's not that they're taking advantage of it. I think these other countries want America to adopt laws and standards that are compatible with their own. As far as kind of what their perception is of the United States, I'm always reminded of Winston Churchill, who famously said, Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted the alternatives. So I feel like we're in that situation now. If you had to say, like, well, tell the legislation that you mentioned, what do I think, having spent my career in Washington? Here's what I would say. I guarantee it'll be passed by the end of the year. I just can't tell you which year. And there's a grain of truth in that, in the sense that I think it's going to happen. It will happen. We are going to get stablecoin legislation, and eventually, I think this will come a little later, we're going to get the market structure rules down. We're going to, the SEC, CFTC divide, all of that stuff, I think it's going to be sorted out. But I'm not sure when it's going to happen. I think there's a better chance that the stablecoin legislation gets through. It's narrower, and it's possible it could get through by the end of the year. I think once we get into 2024, we have the presidential election cycle. But the rest of the world has literally, I mean, the European Union, as Jeremy said earlier today, they've got MiCA passed, Japan, Singapore, the Middle East, every other jurisdiction of any import has moved forward on this. So the United States will act. And in fact, the official position of the United States, of the Biden administration, is we need stablecoin and other digital asset legislation, right? It's just a matter of working out the kinks. And unfortunately, Washington has gotten to the point where, look, everyone in this room knows it is quite dysfunctional. It is. I mean, the fact that we're having these debt limit talks and the government shutdown is sort of emblematic of the situation there. But ultimately, it's going to happen, right? And so the point earlier is you guys have to be smart. You have to be prudent. That's part of my job, is to basically instruct Circle and sort of how do we navigate this environment. But ultimately, you guys have to push forward. You're the developers. You are the future here. And my advice to all of you is think about where the law needs to be, where the regulation should be, where policy needs to be. What is a sound regulatory environment? What should your products look like in that environment? Get there first, and the regulations will catch up.
I really like that. And we heard from Yolanda McWilliams and Christian Carlo earlier today, and they talked a little bit about the generational divide that really is between lawmakers in the US and the general populace. And in case it wasn't obvious from my accent, I'm not from this country originally, but kind of seeing it from overseas, there does seem to be a younger governing body in other countries. And so I have a guess that that's probably part of the reason that the US is that little bit behind, but that's just one Australian's view.
Yeah, and the work that you've done is we've complied with standards that aren't necessarily applicable to Circle from a legal standpoint today, because we believe one day they will be, right? And if we're going to lead in this environment, then we want to have the standard. And sort of the transparency rules that Jeremy talked about earlier, like us putting our reserves on the website, everyone can see them, that's not mandated anywhere. But our view is, like, eventually, that's going to be that's what the market, we perceive it once, and that's what we think the standard should be. So we're trying to get there first, and we're hoping the regulation will catch up later.
Yeah, plus it's just the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. So that would be sort of some advice, like down the line. Think about that as you're constructing your businesses, your technology, in a world of regulatory uncertainty.
For sure. So, I mean, the obvious question that I have to ask then is this the end of shadowy actors? We've got a whole bunch of announcements on stage and in the past few months about what Circle's doing. We've got a whole bunch of really institutional names really getting into blockchain now, but there are still shadowy actors out there. So what now?
As a former regulator, I will say there will always be shadowy actors. The securities markets have existed for close to 100 years, and in regulated form. We still have, Madoffs and people like that. The commodity markets have been traded for 150 years. We still have people trying to corner the market and violate the rules. So you're always going to have shadowy actors. But I don't think the industry itself will be viewed by the vast majority of the population, not the people in this room, but the vast majority of the population, as being comprised majority of shadowy actors. So it's basically all of us in this room, are the future of this industry, and we can help drive out those shadowy actors, at least to a minimum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where it becomes our job then to actually educate folks on the power of the technology and how that actually makes it more transparent and allows less places for people to hide. Whenever I have people interviewing for the role who haven't actually done investigations in blockchain before, they kind of freak out and go, oh, well, how do you investigate it? You don't know who it is. And it's like, yeah, okay, but think about after 9/11. Think about the sheer number of man hours that went into figuring out who funded it, the number of subpoenas that had to be filed, because every time there was a transaction, okay, now it's another bank, I've got to go subpoena, and on and on and on it went. After the January 6th insurrection, within 24 hours, Reddit had figured out who funded it. Like, that kind of power is unbelievable. And so it's just a matter of harnessing that and kind of fighting out the shadows from there, in my view at least.
Totally agree. Well, do you want to open it up for, we can make this an interactive session. Does anyone have any questions? Do you have any comments? What do you guys think? Is there any other jurisdiction? I know there's more. Anybody have a perspective on a jurisdiction that if you were to go to Washington today and say, Congressman McHenry, you need to look at X country and say, do it the way they've been doing it. Anybody have any ideas? Mm-hmm. Anybody here from Brazil? All right. Well, we'll have to reserve that. No, we've been very impressed with Brazil. The central bank governor, in particular, understands the power of block. They have their own proprietary blockchain, or they have their own, governmental central bank chain, and they're really moving ahead. So yeah, it's a great example.
So I have a question, actually. I'm not a blockchain expert. I work for a media organization. I'm not a reporter either.
Thank God.
One of the, I've been hearing all today about how great this is, how great USDC is, and all the positives. There might be some bad actors, there might be other things, but I'm curious, is there a real argument from people who would say it's not so great? And what would that argument be? I'm just kind of curious what the other side of this is.
Well, I can think of two foreign powers who have central banks and their own CBDCs that don't want to probably see USDC do well, right? I won't name them, but they're known as strategic competitors, but they have their own central bank digital currencies that are equipped with surveillance, and they can see what their citizens are doing. USDC is the antithesis of that. Our view is public blockchains, privately issued stablecoins that are soundly regulated, that respect privacy in people's transactions. So I would say, there are governments out there, and I sat on the Financial Stability Board with central banks from all these different countries, and there is in the back of their minds sort of a concern, I don't know if we want private sector stablecoins because we want to control it. Now, I think there are sound reasons to say, look, the way that USDC is set up, for example, is backed dollar for dollar. So we're not actually expanding the money supply and things like that, but we provide that extra layer of privacy protection, because I think many people in this room and in other rooms would be very concerned about a government dollar where the government can basically see everything you've purchased at any time. You want to add to that, Corey?
Follow up to that question, because I think that's a good question. So what would happen if you had a stablecoin, for instance, that didn't adhere to the same standards that Circle does, perhaps because there's
Yes.
a total gap in law or lack of U.S. leadership in promulgating those laws?
Right. So who's the other group that does it? So sort of the central banks that want their own digital currency and don't like private sector stable coins. The other are stable coins that don't want to be transparent, that don't want to be held to the same standards, that don't want people like Joe working there making sure they comply with AML, CTF, right? The shadow stable coins. And there are some that are out there. And so they don't want us to succeed either. Yes.
So I'm in the privacy space. I grew up So I'm curious about your, if you have any take about the Tornado Cash issue, or so in general, high privacy technology implemented in blockchain, and how Circle, and stablecoin is, how you view this.
Yeah, and that might actually be a better question for Joe, since you work in that space. Sort of, how do we deal with issues like that?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because something like a mixer, like Tornado Cash or Blender.io, there are legitimate use cases for them. The example that I've seen used a lot is Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum, actually used Tornado Cash himself to be able to donate money to Ukraine, and he did that because he didn't want Putin to be able to see it was him. That said, because of that privacy technology, there is just that inherent risk of being misused, as we saw with Tornado Cash and the amount of North Korean money that was laundered through there. So then it becomes a case of, how do we make sure that those shadow actors don't have a place to hide? How do we make sure that institutions or protocols that have the ability to do that kind of stuff and provide that level of anonymity still have checks and balances in place? So when the law enforcement comes knocking, they've got somebody who they can actually subpoena. They've got somebody who they can actually get ID on and understand who it is. I think there's lots of arguments you can make on the philosophical side about whether OFAC should be designating a piece of software versus a human and on like that. But I think kind of at the root of the issue is that we want to make sure that technology is used for good and that it's not exploited by bad people.
Yeah, so there's always going to be a balance between sort of national security, counterterrorism, and privacy. But I would say that some of the countries have gone far beyond that in invading privacy. And so I think we want to think about, particularly in the West, what do we want our future digital asset, particularly payment stablecoins, to look like? Anybody else?
Probably got time for one more question, and I know we're holding you up from cocktails, so I promise we'll be quick.
But it looks like we're going to still get you to cocktails first.
Heath, this is a trivial question, but it might be fun. We're in a political season. You understand politics as well as government. When you look at the field of candidates for president, on each side, Republican, Democrat, who do you think would be the president who would be best able to guide an administration to accept what we're developing here?
Oh, that's a great question. If I had an answer to that, I'd be working on a campaign. So I don't think I have a particular candidate in mind on either side. Let's assume that President Biden is the nominee. I think the real question is the nominee on both sides, or on each side, going to surround himself or herself with the right people that have an openness to technology? There's no candidate out there now that I would say seems adverse to it, at least sort of openly, at least payment stablecoins. I do think I've seen on the far left, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren sort of crowd. There's clearly a view that if it's a digital asset, then it must be illegitimate, and we don't want to do anything, including having a regulatory regime which would somehow legitimize it. So I would say, if there's a candidate with that viewpoint, I think that's going to be a problem. But I don't have a problem with a candidate that's skeptical, right? After everything that's happened in this in sort of the crypto industry in the last couple of years, there is a degree of skepticism out there. I think we have to acknowledge that and say, look, there were bad actors, there were the shadowy figures. I mean, all that stuff exists, but this also has a tremendous amount of promise, and we can't just sort of throw it away, just like the internet, back in the early days, because there are bad aspects to it. So at this point, I don't see any candidate that I would look at and say, wow, we can't have that person in there because of their views on this particular industry. But it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in debates. You've already seen in some of the campaigns are addressing the CBDC thing. That is becoming a political sort of football that we're seeing tossed around. So I wonder if there'll be more to come. But what I would say is that for everybody in this room, most of you, except for those of you from France or whatever, you may be participating in the political process. Don't be afraid to raise these issues. See what the campaigns say, and get a reaction. Because I think it's important enough that it does need to be on a national agenda, particularly the future of Web3.
Absolutely, and vote. It doesn't matter which way you vote, just vote. That's my plug. All right, looks like we've got one more, two more.
Thank you. So my question is regarding dollarization, because I think like we're talking about the benefits it bring to like people say LATAM, but how would that impact the monetary policy in those countries? Because a lot of these countries are like democratic countries, but they are sort of like fragile democracy. By dollarizing them, would that like risk like the stability of those countries and pushing them towards more authoritarian regime, which can easily block the use of like say USDC in the long term?
Right.
How do we
Will it be?
balance
I mean, what I would say is there's probably, sort of an Aristotelian golden mean, where the influx of dollars and the public's ability to get their hands on dollars will send the signal to the government and the central bank that they need to be disciplined. They can't debase their currency. So I would say at this point, I'm not sure there's any country where, I would say if there's a country that has a monetary policy they can stand behind, and the public has confidence in it, they'll want to have a sufficient amount of the domestic currency and not just dollars. But it's really those countries, at least this is what we're seeing when we look out at the dollarization, it's really those countries where the people cannot depend on the local currency because the central bank and the governments are debasing it, or those countries where there's a lot of migrants and there's a lot of dollars going back and forth. But ultimately, in those countries, they do translate it back into the domestic currency if it's a reliable currency. So I think at this point, what I would say is what we're seeing is it's a disciplining tool for those countries as opposed to something that's undermining them.
Awesome. Let's do our last question here.
I think you answered it because it was going to be around if I'm a central banker, how can you make sure I'm not, I mean, there's legitimate concerns for having a private coin operating within my jurisdiction, right? So
You've got to make sure it's well regulated, soundly regulated. And so my view is that once there's universal standards, the Financial Stability Board is obviously put out at a high level. This is what we expect. I think once the G20 countries adopt that, then I would expect other countries in the G20 to sort of recognize the stablecoin regimes. And if you're issuing a stablecoin from those regimes, you're regulated according to those standards. Then I see, it flowing through. If you're in the Seychelles and you're issuing a stable coin into your country that has no regime, they're not transparent at all, you don't know what the reserves are, and maybe they're not even backed by dollars, then I would worry. And I would ban those stable coins just like Canada has banned Tether.
thank you.
Awesome. So with that, I will let you all go. I know it's cocktail hour.
Outstanding.
Thank you very much, everybody,
Thank you so
for joining
much.
us. Thank
this
you,
was a lot of
Heath.
fun. Thank you.